This is a very expensive gentleman's folder knife. So what am I going to do with it? Make a tiny cheeseburger. Don't worry, I'm going to talk about the real knife testing that I did with this as well. We'll also disassemble it and show you how it's made. But first, let's do the cheeseburger. First off, a tiny burger needs a tiny bun. So let's trim some bread. I guess you could call this a dexterity test for how well the knife works in fine cutting of small objects. That's something you need to do, right? Let's cut our bun out of one of the very end pieces. I'll use the rest of this for a sandwich later, so don't worry, nothing's going to go to waste. I think this piece looks good. This knife does have a very fine point. It has something on it that you don't normally see on production knives, which is a distal taper. It means the knife gets thinner from this point, from the handle all the way out to the point. It's a steady thinning or tapering of the blade. And while that means that this doesn't have the greatest tip strength, I'm not going to do my 2x4 test that I usually do otherwise because I don't want to bend it. It does mean that the knife has really fine, precise ability to get into tight spaces and cut my tiny little burger bun here. Yay! For the next part of this test, we're going to cut up our beef. But we're not just cutting up a normal beef patty. Oh no, we're cutting up completely solid frozen to -30 degrees beef patty. Those of you who watch this channel know I've actually bent knives doing this test before. So here we go. All right, I am levering down into that patty, working my way through it with a lot of pressure. And the slim grinds of this knife are actually doing really well. The other knives that I used before did not cut into this sort of meat as well as this one is doing. And I know that looks really slow, and it is, but it's getting right in there. And it's cutting pretty decently. I'm actually very happy with that. One thing that I did notice about this knife as I was getting it out of the box and doing my unboxing video is these kind of sharp edges on the back here. Right along the back and right along the front. That titanium's not rounded off super well. And I am noticing that. It's digging into my hand a little bit as I push down into the patty here. But it's going through. I split that all the way through. Now we got to get the rest of it and shape it to the shape of our bun. And then we're shaving down the corners like so. Wow, that's cutting really well. All right, there is our tiny burger patty. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good given how frozen it is. Let's move on and do some cooking. So now we're going to cook our tiny patty in our tiny pan with a little bit of oil and a little bit of salt. Here is our tiny burger patty with our tiny cooking tongs going in the pan. Good sizzle there. Always important for a burger. While that's cooking, I want to point out that the edge on this knife that I cut through all that super frozen beef with is still very sharp. It didn't really lose anything. Edge retention is very good. The sharpness testing or the edge retention testing that I did with this knife was a little odd at first. So I did my normal testing with it. It did at first 250 cuts, and then I thought it was going to be done. But what it did was form a little burr on the knife, and that, after I did a few more cuts, actually wore off and the knife was sharp again. So it wire edged slightly, but it did do 400 cuts in my edge retention testing. Got to flip the burger. So the Vanax is properly heat treated. It did well, and I'm happy with how well it retained an edge. even on a knife this expensive. Back to my burger. It's cooking quick. There's my little burger getting all nice and browned. Gonna be tasty. I'm gonna smash it. It's a smash burger, right? Since it's so small, I actually have to do my burger smash with a spoon. There we go. That'll get it all nice and fully cooked and even. I'll flip it one more time. With my tiniest tongs in the world. All right, I think it's done. Let's get it on a plate. A tiny burger needs tiny veggies. Let's cut our onion. I'm going to use the very end here that usually goes to waste. Just this part, we're going to peel it, and we'll use these little slices of onion rings that would normally get tossed. I will slice it very thinly. There we go. That ought to be plenty of onion for our tiny burger. Next, we will have our lettuce. I'll tell you what, that knife sliced super thin very easily. That's a great little onion slice. Definitely still has an edge. Now we have our tiny lettuce. Obviously very sharp. Let's try a slice this way through lettuce. I've never sharpness tested on lettuce before. Wow, that is sharp. Yikes. Good stuff. All right, we're plating up. We have our tiny bottom bun. We're going to put a tiny little bit of mayo on the bottom bun and the top bun. I'd like a double mayo. Tiny mayo. We'll get our tiny burger patty. Boom, right there. We've got our tiny lettuce. Actually, let's go with onion. Onion goes on the burger patty, right? Right on the meat. Get the savory on the savory. Boom. Then there's our tiny lettuce. We've got our tiny tomato slices. And then with our top bun, we got to get our tiny mustard. Hopefully I can get just a little bit of mustard. Oh, perfect. That's great. Tiny mustard. Tiny ketchup. This is going to be high risk operation. Oh, there we go. Oh, yay. Hey, I thought that was going to go badly. Here's the top bun. Get the mayo on there. What are we missing? Oh, pickles. I almost forgot the pickles. We need a spoon. I wasn't able to find tiny enough pickles, so we're going to have to go with relish and use that as pickles. I'm going to put it on the bun. Oop. Oop. Right there. All right, we got our pickles, we got our lettuce, we got our tomato, we got our ketchup, mustard, etc. Onion. There is, oh, we didn't do our cheese. Ooh, I have to do the cheese. Okay. And very carefully remove the toppings. We cannot have a cheeseburger without cheese. I did not melt the cheese previously, so we're going to have to melt the cheese with a blowtorch. First, we need to make a burger-sized piece of cheese, a tiny burger-sized piece of cheese. Let's get it all trimmed. Again, nice fine work with that very slim tip of the knife. There is my cheese and my blowtorch. This is part of a kit that my wife got me for our anniversary. There we go, melting the cheese with the blowtorch. We got some nice browning on the cheese. Perfect. That is going to be, oh no, onions. A cheeseburger, yeah. All right, there is my tiny cheeseburger. We are going to finish filming about the knife, I'm going to disassemble it here real quick, and then we'll eat the cheeseburger. Let's do a quick disassembly because there are some impressive things going on here. First of all, this thing is pretty light for such a large knife, only 4.46 ounces. By comparison, the zero tolerance 452 carbon fiber, which is a pretty impressively designed knife, is very similar. 4.26 ounces on the zero tolerance, but it has a carbon fiber scale, whereas this one is full titanium. And you'll see as we disassemble it how they were able to get it that light. Next to another knife, just for comparison really quick, Hogue Deca, which is Benchmade bug out size. So you can see this is a pretty large knife we're talking about here. On the disassembly front, everything is T8, which is a nice thing to see. I much prefer that to the little T6s that want to strip all the time. There's obviously some thread locker on that pivot bolt, so it's took quite a bit of torque to get it out. And there is a really cool pivot collar set down into the titanium there. Let's get the back two bolts. There's only 3 bolts on this, 2 on the back there, and then the pivot bolt. So they've gone kind of minimal there. Nice collared bolt there. That's a custom fastener. Pretty cool. One thing I want to talk about, and we'll show as we get this back together after the disassembly, is the action on this thing. So even factory, factory action was absolutely perfect. Fall closed. You can see the back spacer actually has a channel in it because the blade sits that close where you need that recess for the blade, and the blade centers perfectly in this. You'll see when we get it back together. Here are the bearings. It is a single row of bearings. I would prefer to see double on a knife of this size, but that's okay. We're talking about a gentleman's folder here, not a hard use knife, as that tip dictates, right? Distal taper tip. You saw that was super useful in some of my testing, but it does mean that you're not going to be, stabbing oil drums with this knife, or you would break it. Bearings are recessed into the blade as well as the handle. They've left a decent amount of thickness to that blade in the middle there, so it's not really a worry for breakage. Another really impressive thing about this knife is that they've given it a really robust lock face. So on my zero tolerance 452, you can see that's a pretty big lock face right there. That area right here where the metal is ground down precisely so that the lock bar, when the knife opens, meets right against that face, and that's what keeps the knife open. That's your locking surface. The fact that they've made this so large on this knife means that is good for durability. So that lock bar slides back and forth across there every time you open and close the knife. The more surface area, the more durability. So that is a great, great way to do that. Pressed in stop pin, which travels in that groove. That is a sturdy way to do a stop pin. There's a lot of contact along that surface there, all the way along the back here, which means that it wears slower as well. So very, very well designed from an engineering standpoint. You can see you've got steel washers recessed into the titanium here. I'll pull one of those out so you can see. So reassembly, you would stick those back in there. There's really not a whole lot to this knife other than the pocket clip. I mean, it's just 3 bolts and a pocket clip, and then your bearings. There's really not a lot to the disassembly and reassembly here. Lots of cool engineering stuff. Oh, I wanted to point out, I'm just taking off the pocket clip so you can see that little screw bolt. The way they got this knife so light is they did a ton of relieving and machining inside the knife here. So that is how they got it to be so light. This titanium is really thin. If I'm feeling it on both sides with my fingers, that is super thin. I wouldn't go so far as to call it delicate, but it's definitely where they saved a ton of weight. And this pivot collar seems like it might even be pressed in. I can't get that out of there easily. So I'm not going to dig around on it. I don't want to scratch it. That's beautiful, right? Let's quickly put this back together, and then we'll do our final thoughts on this knife and what is good about it and whether or not it's worth its very lofty price tag, right? Because this is an expensive knife. You're paying a lot of money to get something that looks like this. You're paying a lot for the Van Ack steel. So there's quite a bit of an expense to this knife. Is it worth it? Well, it might be worth it to you. That's things are worth kind of what you will pay for them, right? If somebody says something is worth something, that's not really any good unless somebody will actually pay them that for it. So as I'm reassembling, we'll be thinking about the value proposition of this knife, because Van Ack's knives are expensive. There are a few on the market. I've got a couple. I got my Indiana EDZ as a factory second that I fixed. So I got that one fairly cheaply. Ooh, recessed bolts on that side, right? That's a cool design feature. This one I did not get at a discount. I bought this with my own money. It was not a promo. It was not a freebie. So because of that, I can say whatever I want about this knife. And while that gives me some freedom, it also means that I'm a little more critical of this knife than some other reviewers might be. There we go. Got that bolt back in there. But there's really not a whole lot to criticize. There's really only one big problem with this knife, which we'll talk about after I get it reassembled here. Those bolts fit in there very tightly. You kind of have to seat them carefully so that they will go all the way in. Everything on this is very well machined and fits together super tightly. And it'll be interesting, since this is the first time I've disassembled it, to see if the centering is as good after I have disassembled it as it was when I got it. Because this thing centered perfectly, and it had perfect fall closed action when I got it. That was the first oil that I have put on it. A reassembly note that I didn't notice the first time I did this, this pivot will only go in one way because this is a press fit pivot. These pivot collars are not the same size. So the bolt will only thread in from this side. This bolt is bigger in diameter than that pivot piece. So you cannot put the pivot bolt in fully if you put it in from the wrong side like I just did. So reassembly note there, you'll see this is going all the way in now like it should. So I'm going to check the centering. Wow, that is dead on, right? And I just reassembled that myself. Action is a little tight. Oh, that's pretty good. Yeah. So even with my reassembly and not really adjusting the pivot collar, that is very close to fall closed. I'm going to give it about 1/8 of a turn there, looser. And now, perfect fall closed action. And if I hold the lock open, yeah, there's no blade play there. That's awesome. Wonderful design, wonderful engineering. Let's talk a little bit about my conclusions here. What do I really think of this knife? So when we're talking about a knife of this price and this pedigree, standards are very high. It doesn't need to just look good. This needs to be a very functional tool. It needs to be beautiful. It needs to be durable so that it will last if you paid this much money for it. And it needs to be comfortable and pleasant to have on you and to use, and something that you want to pick up and hold and use for its intended purpose. This knife does good with most of those things. As you've seen from my testing, it's durable. As you've seen, it has very good functionality. That blade grind is brilliant. It does a great job of being durable and leaving meat behind the edge and cutting well and holding an edge. Full marks for all of those on this knife. Where it falls a bit flat is in the comfortable department. That is really my only complaint with this knife. Those sharp edges on the back of the handle and on the front of the handle just dig into your hands, and it's not terrible, right? But this knife at this price needs to be excellent. It needs to be perfect. If you're going to pay $400 for a pocket knife, when you can get a perfectly good pocket knife that'll last a long time for 80 bucks, there's a very high standard here. And I just think this knife is a little disappointing because of the comfort. It's so close, and I will end up keeping this knife because I like it so much, but it's just a little disappointing. And I'm sad about that. I wish that it were perfect. I will continue to look for my Holy Grail Gentleman's Folder, but this is really close. If you really want the Vanax, if you really love the anodization, it's hard to beat. I will also point out those handles that are so pretty are a little bit slippery. I would rather have the kind of bead blasted titanium, like on the Indiana Knives EDZ that I have right here. That is better for grip, but it doesn't quite look as good. So I understand why they did that. And there are bead blasted versions of this knife, but they don't have the beautiful anodizing. They just have, or the flaming, I guess. They just have a solid color, which for a knife this expensive, it should look better than that. So that is my thoughts on the WE Acuminal. It is durable, it is beautiful, it is very functional, it's a wonderful design, it's engineered, very sturdy, but the handle comfort is just a little disappointing. Now I get to eat my tiny cheeseburger. It's not like we're going to make woolly mammoths any more extinct. They're all extinct anyway.